Hello, I'm Lisa Hepp, and I'm an epidemiologist at the Institute for Global Tobacco Control at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. In this presentation, I'll provide you with a brief background on what secondhand smoke is, and also what particulate matter 2.5 means. We'll review and highlight the steps necessary to follow when conducting an active monitoring study, also known as particulate matter. We'll review the field materials you'll need, the labeling procedures, any data collection sheets you might use in the field, as well as the sample collection process itself, and then a brief overview of the analysis. In addition, I'll be demonstrating how you can utilize an example protocol that monitors PM2.5 in public places. Before we go any further, let's discuss what exactly secondhand smoke is. So secondhand smoke is actually a mixture of gas and particles in the air, and it comes from two parts of smoke. One part is called mainstream smoke and the other is side stream smoke. Mainstream smoke is which is actually exhaled by the smoker, and side stream smoke comes from the cigarette itself. Cigarette smoke contains over 4,000 chemicals known to be dangerous and harmful. Many of those same chemicals and compounds are actually also found in secondhand smoke. Exposure to secondhand smoke causes many diseases in children and adults, such as heart disease, acute respiratory illness, and lung disease, such as cancer. So why exactly is it important to monitor secondhand smoke? There are many different reasons why you can monitor or feel the need to monitor secondhand smoke, and we've listed just a few here. One of the main reasons is to document the distribution and extent of exposure in an effort to give an estimate of health risks associated with those who are exposed. It's also really helpful to use in terms of motivating policy change so that you could implement new smoking bans and regulations in a community. It's also helpful to provide evidence to sort of monitor the compliance or to determine if enforcement is actually put in place for policies and regulations that already exist. The data collected from monitoring secondhand smoke can also be used to educate policymakers or leaders in the community on why you would want to change certain policies to move towards a smoke-free environment and why that's beneficial in the long term for society. It's also helpful to monitor trends over time so that you can see before a policy was implemented what the levels of secondhand smoke might have been, what the levels are when a policy is actually implemented, and then several time points after the policy has been put into place, to again determine if enforcement is actually being used, or to see if you actually are getting decreases in the trends of secondhand smoke exposure. It's also helpful to compare different types of buildings or cities or regions to see if the levels are the same or consistent over time, or if there's another factor influencing why smoking or secondhand smoke rates are going up or down. Here we see a figure that illustrates how secondhand smoke can be monitored at different levels. It can be monitored in the environment through air monitoring, active or passive, which this presentation focuses on active monitoring through particulate matter, but it can also be measured through biomonitoring with the use of biomarkers. The source of secondhand smoke would be the smoker who's releasing or blowing smoke out into the environment. And through air monitoring at the active level or the passive level, the concentration is dependent on the volume of the room, the number of smokers in the room, and how long each person would actually be in the room to be exposed. All of those are variables that would affect the amount of secondhand smoke exposure each person would receive. So we just reviewed what secondhand smoke is, but what exactly does it mean to say that you're going to measure or look at particulate matter, specifically particulate matter 2.5? So secondhand smoke actually is made up of particulate matter. Secondhand smoke is made up of gas and little particles that are suspended in the air. So those little particles and gaseous pieces are actually particulate matter. Smoking is a combustion process that actually generates particulate matter. And with this particular presentation and study to monitor or measure secondhand smoke exposure levels, we'll be focusing on PM2.5. So PM2.5 is actually defined as particles less than or equal to 2.5 microns in size. So 2.5 just refers to the size of the particles suspended in the air. There are many different size particles actually in the environment, depending on the different types of pollution that are being put into the air, such as 10 microns. But we're going to be focusing again on 2.5. Large quantities of PM2.5, again, are released from burning cigarettes, but that's not the only source of PM2.5. Anything where there's a fire or a combustion process will actually generate particulate matter, specifically 2.5, such as combustion engines, again, fires, burning of solid cooking fuels, and even candles can actually release particulate matter into the environment. So PM2.5, they're actually very tiny pieces of matter suspended in the environment that can easily be inhaled deep into the lungs because of their size. Particulate matter, especially at 2.5 level, but at other levels as well, is associated with adverse health effects, including increased respiratory symptoms such as irritation of the airways, coughing, or difficulty breathing. Decreased lung function has also been noted, as well as aggravated asthma associated with particulate matter. So as I've mentioned, we're going to be using particulate matter 2.5 as a marker of secondhand smoke. It's what we're actually going to be measuring out in the environment to determine the levels of secondhand smoke. So there are advantages and limitations or disadvantages with using this as a marker for secondhand smoke. PM2.5 can easily be collected in a discrete manner so that people in the venue where you might be collecting samples at would have no idea that you're taking a measurement. It's also useful because it can measure data in real time. So as soon as a smoker perhaps walks by you while you have your PM2.5 machine, you'll actually get an increase in your readings and be able to note, oh, well, there were several smokers right by me at that period of time. As I mentioned, there are some limitations or drawbacks to using PM2.5 as a marker. It's not specific to tobacco smoke. As I mentioned previously in the slides, PM2.5 exists in the environment regardless of tobacco smoke. So candles or combustion fuels or burning cooking fuels, that'll actually release PM2.5 as well as smoking. So there's no way to pinpoint that the readings that you see from your PM2.5 machine are actually related to tobacco smoke specifically. However, if you're in an environment such as a smoky bar, it's going to most likely be the main cause of particulate matter in that environment. The structure of the venue where you would actually be collecting PM2.5 actually can impact your collection or what your readings would show as well. As I mentioned earlier with the figure, the room volume can affect the levels of secondhand smoke or particulate matter, but also the structure itself. So if it's open to the outside and you have a lot of traffic going by, that's going to affect what your results are in terms of measuring particulate matter. So depending on your study plan or your study design, you can have many different types of objectives for your study. Your objectives are, of course, related to the goals of the study, and the goals of the study or of your plan to use PM2.5 should actually be developed before you go out into the field. So at this point, if you're getting ready to do some field training, which is what this presentation is meant to do, you should already have your goals and objectives defined. So we'll be using some example objectives of a PM2.5 study just to illustrate some different things that you can actually do with the machine and measuring secondhand smoke. So here, one of the objectives we've decided to use for an example study would be to measure the levels of particulate matter 2.5 in various public places to give an idea of what the different exposure levels to secondhand smoke are. So we would go to hospitals, schools, government offices, restaurants, and bars and nightclubs to give a quick snapshot of a particular city or several cities within a region. You can also use PM2.5 to identify secondhand smoke exposure in different places to support, again, progressive policy changes or to support reasons why you want to enforce some of the regulations in a better way. And the last objective here would be to compare indoor air quality with the World Health Organization or the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's air quality standards in an effort to determine if your region or your city is meeting those guidelines established by these two organizations, and to see if you're outside of those bounds or if you really have a big problem going on. So at this point, you may be asking yourself, what exactly does a PM2.5 machine look like, and how would you actually be using it to collect secondhand smoke exposure data? We recommend using the TSI Side Pack AM510 Personal Aerosol Monitor, which weighs approximately 1 pound, so it's relatively light. Before you can actually go out into the field and use the TSI Side Pack, you would need to actually get some things done beforehand, and those would include such things as selecting the buildings or the venues that you wish to monitor or to collect PM2.5 samples in order to measure secondhand smoke exposure. For this particular example study, we decided to use a convenience sample. And by convenience, I mean a non-random sample. We had some idea of the locations that we wanted to go to, and we just picked those because they were easy for us and because we had limited resources to go out into the field. And we knew that we could quickly get in there, get some data, and come back and generate some results. Now, you can always have a much more complex sampling scheme and do a random sampling of the various buildings in a particular area or compare regions. But those things depend on your financial situation and the amount of time that you have to collect the data. You would want to create some sort of map if you're going to many locations at one time or within a particular study so that you can organize your route to each of the venues that you'll be visiting, just to save yourself some time instead of going north of the city and then later in the day you need to be south of the city to avoid sitting in traffic for several hours or avoiding any sort of frustration or headaches associated with traveling and long distances. So it's helpful, regardless of the sampling strategy that you use to select your buildings, to create a plan or a route or map of the different locations or venues that you'll be visiting throughout the study. By creating a map or a plan, it'll make travel time much more efficient and you'll be able to conduct the study in a better, easy manner. So while you're getting ready to go out into the field and you're gathering all of your different materials that you'll need for the study and ensuring that you've created your map and you have your sample selection of your buildings, you want to make sure that your side pack is actually stored in a safe environment. Again, ideally in a smoke-free environment would be best, just to protect the machine. But it's a fragile piece of equipment, so you want to make sure that it's not going to be jostled or accidentally bumped off a shelf or just kept on the floor. So that's important, to handle the machine in a delicate manner. And then you also want to become familiar with the side pack itself, reviewing its equipment components, as well as any user guides or quick diagrams that might be associated or come with the product itself. It can save you some time out in the field so you're not fumbling with the machine. In addition to becoming familiar with the materials and how to operate the side pack, you do want to be careful not to accidentally change any of the preset requirements that are put onto the machine, especially if you are borrowing it from another institution. Generally, the instruments have been sort of calibrated or set to certain standards to collect the sample in an appropriate manner. So you just want to be aware of these settings so that when you are familiarizing yourself with the machine, you don't accidentally change these settings. If you have any questions, you can always contact local support personnel for further assistance. In this slide, we see a table of the different types of venues that our example protocol or our example study plan utilizes. So as I mentioned previously, we would be going to hospitals, secondary schools, city governments, restaurants, or entertainment venues to collect a sample of secondhand smoke exposure in each of these different venues. We did this just through a convenient sample, non-random. We knew that we could get access to these different types of places. So within each hospital or within each government building, we had specific rooms that we wanted to monitor. Instead of just going in to each of these buildings and walking around for a period of time and taking measurements, we felt it was important to specifically go to certain rooms. Now, this may not be the case with your study plan. You might have a different objective or goal. Another objective or goal would just be to monitor bars and restaurants. And there's really no different rooms in those types of things. As you see here, even on the table, we have something just called the main dining area. But for this protocol, again, we focused on hospitals in addition to restaurants and bars, schools and government buildings. And so in each of those different rooms, we recommended at least 30 minutes spent in those areas to get a sample. So before you go into the building, you want to spend at least 5 minutes outside collecting background data so that you have a period of time before you actually collect your true sample. And again, that should be at least 5 minutes just on the outside of the building, not before you go into each of the rooms. And then you would go in and into each of the rooms and start logging data. And when you would enter into each of these different rooms, you would want to record the time so that you could see the time that you were in each of the rooms in correspondence to the data that you're actually collecting. So that would mean when you would leave a room, you would also want to record it. So for instance, you're at a hospital. Before you go into the hospital, you wait outside with the machine on for 5 minutes. Then you would go in, and the minute you enter into the waiting room, you would go ahead and log in the time on a sample collection sheet. We'll review this all in further detail. You would stay in that room for approximately 30 minutes, and then once you left that room, you would again log the time. and you would proceed to the doctor's lounge. Once you enter the doctor's lounge, you would enter the time onto your sheet. You would hang out in that room for approximately 30 minutes. When you left the doctor's lounge, again, you would record the time. And this process would continue all the way through until you were ready to leave the hospital. And then you would wait outside for 5 minutes before you went back to the office or went on to the next building. So again, you want to make sure before you enter a building and once you leave the building that you remain in that outside environment for approximately 5 minutes to collect any sort of background data that might exist. So that you can have this, in essence, to compare sort of to the data that you've collected within each of the venues. Now, it's important to note that if you're outside on a busy street and a giant bus goes by or a motorcade and there's a lot of exhaust, you probably want to document that as well, because that will give you sort of a false impression of how dirty or how much particulate matter is actually in the outside environment compared to the inside environment. So you just want to make sure that you document that. But again, measuring the data on the outside just gives you an overall picture of what's happening outside of the building in comparison to the inside. As one of the advantages I mentioned earlier in the presentation about using PM2.5 as a method to collect secondhand smoke exposure data, you can collect it discreetly, meaning that you don't always have to have permission from each of the venues to go in and collect a sample. However, in some instances, you may want to get the permission from the building authority to go in and collect a sample, or perhaps a building may contact you and ask you to take measurements. In those instances, it's not necessary to be so discreet or hide the TSI side pack. You can just freely go into those venues and sit down for a bit and collect a sample. But again, we'll review some of those different options in future slides. This is just an illustration or a map of how you could plan a route out. As you see with the symbols, you could go to those on day 1 versus the other ones on day 2, just to sort of have a strategy of how you're going to go out into the field. There are a number of different materials that you'll need once you're ready to begin field work. The main one, as we have just seen, was the TSI Side Pack AM510 Personal Aerosol Monitor. We'll just refer to it from this point on as the Side Pack. So the side pack measures the particulate matter 2.5. Now there are 2 different categories of pieces of equipment that you'll need. You'll need equipment that you'll use in an office or a clean work environment, something that is not in a smoky environment, of course, and not is subjected to high pollution rates, that has a nice work surface where you can handle the TSI side pack before you go out in the field. And then you'll also need your specific equipment for the field. So within the clean work environment, you'll need the software called Track Pro software version 3.4 or later that's associated with the side pack. That's like a disk that you would use to put into the computer to set up the program and the software onto your computer so that you can plug in your side pack and download the data. You'll also need the USB cable, which will connect the side pack to the computer. You'll need something called a zero filter. You'll need Kim wipe tissues. You'll need impact grease and a screwdriver. Now, if you purchase the side pack, these items come with it, minus the Kim wipe tissues. Or if you were to borrow or rent a side pack, these items will also come with the side pack. For the field, you'll need the side pack, of course, as well as the Tygon clear plastic tubing. The tubing is what actually draws in the air into the machine. In addition, you'll need a computer that runs Microsoft Windows, and it'll need to be a PC, not a Mac or an Apple computer. If you're going to be collecting a sample without the permission of the venue or the building authorities, it's helpful and necessary actually to have a purse or a bag or a soft briefcase to actually conceal the side pack. So the bag needs to be large enough to place a 1-pound instrument in it. It's helpful to have a watch. And then you'll need any forms that you are going to be using to collect observations on, as well as any labels. It's often helpful to establish a project coordinator in addition to any field staff that you have, especially if you have a larger study or a larger research plan that you're trying to follow with measuring particulate matter. And in this particular instance, as we mentioned, we were going to several different venues, and within those venues, several different room locations. So it would be helpful to have someone to oversee and help organize all of that. And we would refer to that person as a project coordinator. So the tasks that the project coordinator would oversee or be responsible for would be storing and maintaining the side pack itself. And by maintaining, I mean all of the different steps that you need to do to operate and keep the side pack running efficiently. And we'll get to those in the next slides. The project coordinator would also then distribute the side pack and materials to the field worker each time that they were going out to measure PM2.5. They would keep track of the buildings and the room locations, as well as any codes or labeling schemes that are associated with those. They would keep track of all of the paperwork, including observation sheets, and any materials that were sent from a collaborating institution. They would help monitor and file and keep records of those materials as well. They would download the data daily from the side pack to the computer to ensure that it was all being backed up and that everything that was collected in the field was being saved appropriately so that nothing was lost. And then once the study was over, they would collect all materials, including the side pack, and if they needed to be sent back to a collaborating institution if the side pack was rented, they would do that. But they'd also then maintain the side pack before they would store it for the next study. So in addition to actually collecting PM2.5 measurements with the side pack, it's helpful and almost crucial to actually have an observation sheet that corresponds with the data that you've collected out in the field. As I mentioned earlier, with the table of the different types of locations that you're going to and how you need to log in the time that you enter and log in the time that you exit, you would actually put that information here on the observation sheet. The observation sheet would also contain the label or the code then that corresponds with the different types of buildings or room locations that you are visiting. So you can have the labels pre-printed that would contain all of this information, or you can actually write it in by hand. So let's review some possible labeling schemes of how you can handle that. So labeling, again, is important, and it needs to use the unique code. A unique code that corresponds to each separate building for each time that you go out into the field. This again is important because if you don't have that connection between your observation sheets and the data that's actually collected and stored on the side pack, there's no way for us to understand or for anyone to do any data analysis on that to know what was going on in that environment or even where that environment was. So it's important that you label things appropriately. So in addition to just labeling the building and the building type, you'd also want to record the side pack number that you used out in the field on that particular day. This is important if you have multiple side packs going out, or if you're borrowing a side pack from an institution and you're sending the side pack back so that data can be removed from it and analyzed in a remote location. This way that they know what side pack you used and what side pack corresponds then to each of the different venues that you went to. So it's helpful to prepare all of the labels of the field materials before going out into the field. This just makes field work faster and more efficient and minimizes the errors. We have an entire labeling presentation on this website for more information. So here we've provided an example labeling scheme that we suggest using when out in the field. But again, this is just a recommendation, and you may come up with your own labeling scheme, or you might have a different labeling scheme that you want to follow altogether. So for the label, as you saw on our observation sheet in the previous couple slides, we have a space for country, city, side pack ID, building type, and building number. Here you see the country code of 356, which is the United Nations country code for India. We followed the United Nations country code, but if you were doing a multi-country study, you wouldn't necessarily have to use that code. You could come up with your own numbers. Or if you were only conducting a study within the country or within your own city, it may not even be necessary to include the country code. However, if you're participating with a research study with us here at Johns Hopkins, for example, it's important to include this number as we have multiple country studies going on at one given time. And it's helpful for us, if we're doing the analysis, to know what country the data actually is coming from quickly. The city code is just a random number assigned to a multi-city study. Each city gets their own numbers. For instance, here in the example, we have 4 cities that we would say we were going out into the field and collecting data at. So Ahmedabad, Chandigarh, Chennai, and Delhi in India randomly got numbers 1 through 4. The side pack ID number is a number that might be associated or put on your side pack if you're borrowing it or renting it from an institution, especially, for instance, from Johns Hopkins. If you're borrowing a side pack or renting it from us, you'll have a 4-digit number on the side of that side pack that you want to go ahead and record. This is helpful for us, as if you are sending the monitors back to us, or the side packs, we can quickly then identify that this monitor was out in India at this specific time, and this data belongs to this research protocol. That's just helpful for us. But some side packs may not have a 4-digit number, unless you wouldn't have anything to fill in there. The building type corresponds to the different venues that you would be going to. In our example earlier, we said we were going to hospitals, schools, governments, and restaurants. And then we just assigned hospital code to be H1, schools S2, government G3, and restaurant entertainment venues R4. Each of those types of venues may have multiple buildings within them. So for instance, you may be going to 5 hospitals, so each of those hospitals would have to have a corresponding hospital number. So 1 through 5. So before we go any further, let's just quickly review a timeline of what it would be like if you were out in the field, just to give you a quick overview of what you'll actually be doing in the field. So at 0 minutes to 5 minutes, you're going to be outside the building or the venue where you're going to go inside and collect your PM2.5 measurements. And you're just going to be logging in data, as we mentioned earlier, as just background data. So you're just standing outside for 5 minutes at least, gathering data. At 5 minutes, you're actually going to proceed into the building and into the room that you're wanting to go in and actually collect some PM2.5 data on. At that point, once you enter into that room, you want to bring out your observation sheet and actually record the time that you entered that specific room. Now again, this is for a multi-room study design or timeline in this instance. If you're only going into one room, for instance in a bar or a restaurant, they only have a main area. Once you are outside at 5 minutes, you can go ahead and enter in the time. So once you cross the threshold, you enter in the time that you've walked into that room for a multi-room study, and then you're actually going to look at your observation sheet and see if there's any other information you need to collect once you're starting to gather PM2.5 data with the side pack. Some things that you might want to collect should be on your observation sheet would be things like the number of people in the room, the number of smokers in the room, if you see any cigarette butts on the floor. But ideally, the main thing at the time points that you need to collect are the number of people in the room and the number of smokers. So you enter in the room, and now you're at like 6 minutes or whatever, 5 minutes. You are counting the number of people and the number of smokers. 15 minutes elapses, and then you again count the number of people and the number of smokers present in the room. And then right before you're ready to leave the room again, you'll count the number of people and the number of smokers. As we mentioned earlier in the figure, the reason that this is important is to determine what the concentration or the effect of smoking has on the PM2.5 measurements in that particular room. So at 30 minutes, you're now ready to exit that room and proceed to the next room within the location. So you would write on your observation sheet the exit time, and then you would walk onto the next room within that building. And again, once you enter the room, then you enter in the time, and you do the same process all over. Once you've entered into the next room within that particular venue, again, you're going to write down the time that you enter the room, and then start counting the number of people and the number of smokers. So each time you go into a new room, you can think of it as 0 time, or at 5 minutes time, you take these observations. Then 15 minutes elapses again in this new room, you count the number of people and the number of smokers. You write this down on your observation sheet. And then when 30 minutes has elapsed in this new location within the building, then you again count the number of people and the number of smokers. And then you're ready to go ahead and exit that room and that building. Once you exit the building, then you need to spend at least 5 minutes outside the building continuously logging data to ensure that you're capturing the information or background data once again, as you did when you were first entering the building. This is just an example timeline. Your timeline might be different based on your study protocol, your study plan, and even your objectives or goals. So thus far, we reviewed or seen actually what the side pack looks like that you'd use to measure and collect PM2.5 data for secondhand smoke exposure. We've briefly talked about labeling, and then we just went over the timeline that you would potentially use out in the field for collecting the data. In the next section, we're actually going to be talking about how the TSI AM510 side pack actually works and the operations and the preparation that goes into using it out in the field.